How about a little Alabama at Ole Miss? Alabama favored by 12 points in this game, 3:30 Eastern on CBS, the greatest theme song of all time. It'll be like orange juice and mouthwash when you got the Big Ten playing on CBS. No disrespect to the Big Ten. I just like my SEC on the CBS, whatever it is. Alabama, like I said, going to Ole Miss. Little Saban versus Kiffin action. And everybody seems to talk about Alabama after they've lost 2 games now, starting to write them off. And Nick Saban said as much in his press conference. So people have written us off. And when I watched that press conference and I saw his expression when he said that, my heart just dropped for Ole Miss. Just, all right, here we go. For them, it's all about refocusing on the process. And Saban talked about it. He said, there's so much pressure on us to win as Alabama that when we win, it's more so relief that we accomplished that result and less so the joy of, wow, we trusted the process, we focused on the process, and we got the result that we wanted. So now that expectations a little less on their shoulders, I would say, because they're not going to be a college football playoff team in all likelihood, and the SEC West is a little bit out of their hands right now. So much to Lane Kiffin's chagrin, this is the Bama team that you don't want to play right now. We're going to predict it. We're going to preview it. It's not my pick in this game just yet, but this is the kind of Bama game that I think you would like to have avoided if you're Lane Kiffin. Now, for them, they're coming off a bye week. And I promise you, Lane Kiffin is not taking this whole Alabama program with any sort of different vision, if you will. Like, he doesn't see Alabama as a different kind of program. And I think that's honestly the way that we should all view this Alabama team, because you look at their losses, they've lost 2 games by 2 plays on the road in some of the toughest places to play. Death Valley and LSU came down to the 2-point conversion. Tennessee, it came down to a field goal that went their way and a field goal that Alabama missed. If those 2 plays swing towards Alabama, they're undefeated. They're the top-ranked team in the country coming to the Grove. So hopefully that refocuses the lens we should view this through. But Ole Miss understands that. And credit to Lane Kiffin for getting his team on the right sort of plane when it comes to their mentality approaching this game. All that's to say, they understand the challenge. Like, that's what I want to drive home for Ole Miss. They're coming off the bye week, obviously, but they understand the challenge that's required of them in this game. There's not going to be any sleepiness for this program. Nonetheless, let's dive into this game and give you some of our hinge points. Is Bryce Young able to get resynced, or rather maybe just get synced up in general with this receiving core? Because they've got some guys, right? Isaiah Bond, Ja'Cory Brooks has really surged as of late, but he hasn't looked totally in sync with those guys. Last week against LSU, whether it was the crowd, whether it was the defense, there's still some blame you put on Bryce Young and his receivers because they were 49% in terms of their completion percentage. I say they because I don't think it's all Bryce Young. There's conversation about his shoulder and him being healthy. I think he's good to go. I think he's a competitor. He's good enough to go. And he'll tell you 25 for 51 just isn't going to cut it. It's not his standard. It's not what they need to win. And that's more to talk about, honestly, going forward. But can they get synced up? Because if they can, then the entire offense heats up. You know it and I know it. If they can throw the ball, well, then guess what? They can run the ball better too. And if they can do both those things effectively, they're going to score a lot of points. They're going to score their typical over 40 points a game that they've been scoring. Didn't have it last week, but guess what that does to Ole Miss? Applies the pressure on them. And Ole Miss is a running football team. I would ask the question, if Alabama's scoring, let's just say they have 28 by half, do you need to put the ball in the air a little bit more if you're Jackson Dart and Lane Kiffin? Which I'm not saying they can't do it. I'm just saying they would be out of their comfort zone in that respect. Now, if they can't, you get back to that frustrated mode, right? Hey, why are we not hitting on these things? Why can't we get the quick game going? Drive stall out, you score less points. I think more crucially, you allow for a recalibration period for the Ole Miss offense. So even if Ole Miss isn't scoring points in the early going, if Bryce Young isn't getting synced up with his receivers and you're having 3-and-outs or you're having drives that stall out, the Ole Miss program has a chance to figure it out, get their sea legs. You saw that against LSU. You saw that happen. LSU scored 17 points in the second half. They adjusted. They figured out what worked for them. If they're down, let's say 14-0 in the first quarter, in the first half, they're not able to have that recalibration period, because then you start to say, we need points fast, and you start to do things that you're not quite as comfortable doing, and you create mistakes, and then the Bama avalanche just sort of ensues. So can Bryce Young and his receivers get synced up? For their sake, you would hope so. The other thing I'm looking at, what does Ole Miss find in the run game? We've already touched on it a little bit. They've run the ball 65% of the time. Like, if you want to look at them from a statistical category, they're like a academy, essentially. I mean, 65% of the time, but they got some dudes to do it. Zach Evans, Quinshon Judkins, even Jackson Dart, to a degree, have all contributed in the run game. Jackson Dart did it really effectively against Texas A&M, but they're averaging 271 yards on the ground. This is a huge game for their offensive line because Bama, even though they didn't have a great performance against LSU, they're stout in that front seven. They've proven it multiple times. One bad day does not make a bad unit. And for Ole Miss, I mean, that's what they want to do. I think the key number that I'm looking at for them, can they get 5 yards a carry? That's what they're averaging on the year. That's what LSU had. And if they can get that number, well, guess what? That means they can dictate the tempo to Alabama. So even though they go quickly on offense, they can sort of dictate to Alabama just how quickly they want to go offensively. And if they want to kind of sugar huddle and slow the game down and say, Bryce Young, you got to watch this part of the game, they could effectively do that. Even more so, it means you're scoring points. Like, maybe you're not doing it in bunches, but you're scoring points if you're getting 5 yards a carry. And then, like we talked about, puts that pressure back on Bama to have to answer scores. So if you can't do that, like we already mentioned, they're out of their comfort zone. And when we've seen this Ole Miss team out of their comfort zone, I'm thinking the Kentucky game. Let's see what else. I'm thinking about the game against, who do I have here, Nick? Kentucky, doesn't matter. When they're out of their comfort zone, when you have their higher volume attempts for Jackson Dart, that's when they have issues as an offense. The Kentucky game, you saw the interception. I'm trying to think who else I had here, Nick, for when they didn't play well. Oh, the LSU game. What am I saying? The LSU game, you saw Jackson Dart out of his comfort zone completely because he was throwing the ball over the yard because they had to. They had to try and answer scores and score more points. That's when they ran into trouble. I'm not saying Jackson Dart can't do it. I'm actually a Jackson Dart believer. I think the kid's super talented. It's a matter of him getting eventually super comfortable in this system because it's new for him, even though we are in week 11. He's going to eventually catch his stride. This is not the kind of game you catch your stride in. If it is, great. Maybe the Alabama secondary doesn't bring the same juice that you would hope they bring if you're Nick Saban, but all that's to say, that's a whole other scenario you don't want to get into. If Jackson Dart has to throw the ball, that's a less favorable situation for Ole Miss. All right? Glad we eventually found what we were talking about there with Jackson Dart and his whole gameplay. Kentucky game, they still won, but had to throw the ball. Didn't look great. So here's the other question I have when it comes to this. Does Ole Miss have a counterpunch? If they can't run the football, are they able to get something in the RPO game? Are they able to get the ball to their playmakers in another fashion? Maybe it's on the perimeter. Maybe it's on the quick game. They got to have something else if they can't run the football. Because you and I know it. If you're walking into a fight and you got one move, brother, you better hope you throw a knockout on that first punch. Because if this thing stretches out and goes the length of a few rounds, you're going to get figured out eventually. Does Ole Miss have a counterpunch to that run game is something that we're watching with bated breath. So here's my final point on this game, and I think it's really interesting. Does Jahmyr Gibbs get to be the thermostat for this Alabama program? I'll explain that a little bit more. When you walk into a room, what sets the temperature? Is it a thermometer or is it a thermostat? Stupid question. It's a thermostat. Jahmyr Gibbs needs to see the football a whole lot because is he the best player on the field? You're probably arguing about whether it's Bryce Young or him. With the football in his hands, in terms of a playmaker, they want to impact the game. It's Jahmyr Gibbs. Only had 15 carries against LSU. I believe he had 8 catches, so he still got to touch the rock a lot. But in the run game especially, if he can just sort of wear down that Ole Miss defense, if he has the opportunity, rather, to wear down that Ole Miss defense, that creates a whole lot of other things for Alabama. Then Alabama has time to figure out the pass game. The pass game as a whole just gets easier for Bryce Young because you got Ja'Cory Brooks running with a little bit more wide open space with those linebackers coming up. They got to play Jahmyr Gibbs. Those safeties, Asheem Young, really talented safety for Ole Miss. If he fills in run support too quickly, more green grass behind him. And that gives you a chance to hit more home runs and change the complexion of this game. I know Jahmyr Gibbs is great in the pass game. Phenomenal hands. He's a matchup problem. But feed him the rock early, let him set the temperature for this game, and good things will happen for Alabama. I'm telling you, 20 plus is my number in terms of carries. I know he's not the biggest back in the world, but that's the workload I need from Jahmyr Gibbs in this game if I want to play the kind of game I want to play if I'm Alabama. So here's our prediction for this game. Nick Saban talking about the process on a Monday press conference, saying we got to refocus. I could feel the energy coming off Nick Saban, and I would just sit and watch it on my laptop. If I'm in the locker room and Nick Saban's given a less filtered version of that to me, I'm just saying they're going to be ready to play this game. There's going to be an enormous amount of intensity. I think they're going to have their best week of practice in Tuscaloosa. That's my feel on it. I'm excited to see what Bama does because they've lost now, I believe it is 2 of the last 3. Doesn't really happen in Tuscaloosa. I think they sort of get all the pressure off their plate. I think they played their best game of the season, which is a scary thought. I think they put it together in a big way, being process and goal-oriented, process-oriented, not goal-oriented. I think it's a bad day for Ole Miss. Ole Miss has got a lot of talent. I think Alabama rolls in this one. I think they win this game 32-18 on the road. The Tide, process-oriented, get back on the right track. The Tide roll. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.